Okay, we are being recorded. Good day again. Nice to see you all. Hope you're well today and ready to complete our work with Immanuel Kant this week in his rather interesting and innovative theory of the categorical imperative. On Monday, I basically set that up and showed it really in light of Kant's response to Hume. Partly, yeah, the idea that we can derive moral prescriptions, in other words, that we can derive from reason and not merely from emotion or subjectivity. We're able to derive moral prescriptions from our reason, and although we can't derive ought directly from is, I don't think he refutes Hume's guillotine. That's for you to determine if you want to think about that problem. I think he does show we can derive ought from something very close to is, really from a subjunctive case. If it were, Kant is saying, if it were the case that what you are about to do is animated by a principle that you can will to be a universal law, right? If that were the case, then in fact you ought to do it. So he's deriving ought from a form of the verb to be, right? From the subjunctive form. If it were the case that in this hypothetical world, your principle could actually become a universal law, the principle according to which you're about to act could be a universal law and would not self-destruct in some logical sense, right? Then in fact you not only may do the action, thereby prescribed, but you must do the action thereby prescribed. You have a perfect duty to do that action. So it's a very strict meta rule for winnowing in or out rather actions that are morally permissible. And for testing rules, basically, that we would be inclined to follow to see whether they pass the test of the categorical imperative. All right? So he derives ought from a subjunctive version of the verb to be and not from is directly. But it's a very interesting and a very illuminating answer, partly to Hume's challenge. And also it's a celebration of the power, an attempt to restore the notion of moral agency to the domain of reason, because Hobbes and after him Hume had certainly tended to mire our sense of what is good and right and just in our passions, our attractions and aversions, and for Hume our subjectivity and a kind of moral skepticism that accompanies that there could never be therefore any kind of universal morality, because it will all be intellectually subjective. Yes, so that's a kind of synopsis of where we got to. Before we continue this morning, to look at Kant's cases, which we're going to do, and also to look at Kant's second formulation. There are really two. As I mentioned to you last day, there's the universal formulation, the first formulation, rather, of the categorical imperative that is going to apply to you only in terms of evaluating what you ought or ought not to do in a given situation. There's a second formulation, which is quite different, in that it is going to be formulation that discusses our relations with others. So morality is not just about ourselves in terms of some hypothetical world, but also in our real relations with other people. And his second formulation, interestingly enough, takes that into account. So we'll have a look at that this morning as well, and some other concepts about human being, which are actually very important today, maybe more important today than they were even in Kant's day, but you may be wise later on if you haven't read ahead to see what Kant gives voice to in terms of important aspects of our moral agency. And we'll have a look at those toward the end of the lecture today. So that's our game plan, all right? So before we carry on with that plan, I just want to know if any of you have questions about anything that we covered last day. I'm perfectly happy to revisit any of it if you want to do so. So please feel free to ask verbally or to type into the chat room any question that you may have. Okay, go for it. Okay, nobody has any burning questions. So do I assume from this that you are all satisfied with what we covered last day, and that you have some handle on it, that you understand what Kant is trying to tell us? So far, so good. Okay. Mimi, Erica, Emily, yes, Mame, Timothy. All right. Kant is not easy, and if you've read further, and I hope you have, I hope you read within text to cover the missing bits, to connect the dots, what we skipped over. And if you read further ahead, in this translation, you'll see that Kant is not easy to read compared to some of the other philosophers we've covered. But what he is saying is very important in terms of his moral theory. Okay. Well, listen, if you're okay so far, then by all means, let's continue where we left off. Let me pull up the text, and then we will carry on from there. So I have it preloaded. We'll just see if, as usual, Blackboard's going to cooperate this morning when I try to share it. It's always an open question. So share Chrome tab, and there it is. Looks like it's working. So you all see this? Yes? I can't see you when you say this without losing the screen. Okay, thank you very much. All right, you can see it. That's good. So we're looking at this formulation. That's where we left off on Monday. His statement of the categorical imperative, and there's only one, meaning that well, actually there's another version of it, but and he phrases it in different ways. If you read the whole groundwork, I think there are 22 or 23 different rephrasings, but they're all equivalent for our purposes. Okay, they all are saying the same thing in a few different ways, but act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. This is really the meta rule for testing any moral rule that whose rightness we want to test. A maxim being a rule or a principle. Okay, it could be one of the 10 Commandments. It could be any other moral rule that you are attempting to test by this means to see if it should be followed, or it could be an immoral rule. It's all the same. Any rule of behavior, any rule of conduct that you want to test, you can use the maxim as a test. And if it passes the test, then you know that it's the right thing to do, and moreover, you have a duty to do it. Right? Because the will is practical reason. Remember Kant's argument about the will being basically practical reason, and that we have a duty to follow those laws which pass this test. All right. And there's another slight formulation. Act as if the reformulation. Act as if the maxim of your action were to become, through your will, a universal law of nature. Okay. And this, if so, then we have a duty. And Kant then says that we have duty. There are really 4 different things going on here. There are duties toward self, and there are duties toward others. And in the second part of this, he will indeed discuss duties toward others. And that's the second half, or the flip side, if you like, of the categorical imperative, that it entails our relationships with other people as well. It would be surprising if it didn't, given that we're talking about something called ethics. Of course, if you're alone on a desert island, then you probably don't have too many ethical duties toward others, because there aren't any others there. Okay, you obviously have duties toward yourself, regardless of whether you're alone or immersed with other people. But our duties toward others will appear and will manifest, obviously, when we are with others, or at least in foreseen contact with others, foreseeable contact with others. Okay. So you have duties toward yourself and duties toward others. And there are also perfect and imperfect duties, and that's a bit of technical terminology on it. What Kant means by perfect duties are basically duties that have no exceptions. Do you remember we discussed this business about deontology, and one of the main weaknesses of deontological ethics in general is that rules tend to have exceptions, right? I mean, that's natural for us. That rules have exceptions is not usually a stumbling block. It's just something we take in stride. Rules have exceptions, right? But the problem in deontology, and we gave examples of it last day, I think, is that we have rules that we could all agree upon, but we'll end up disagreeing on the exceptions. Remember, if we're talking about self-defense as an exception to the rule "thou shalt not kill," we're talking about war, we're talking about capital punishment, we're talking about abortion. There are all these scenarios that arise in our real lives where there are going to be exceptions to this rule about not killing human beings. And sometimes these exceptions themselves become the focus of extremely bitter and sometimes even violent quarrels, do they not? So it's not over the rule. We're not arguing about the rule. We're arguing about what the exceptions should be to the rule. It's a second-order moral question, and one that often drives more conflict than the actual rule does. So Kant, partly, you could, if you want to be accusatory, you could say he evades it, but his own way of responding to it is by talking about perfect duties, and a perfect duty is one that has no exceptions. So one way to avoid the question of what do we do about the exceptions is to say, well, in some cases there are no exceptions. If a duty is perfect, it means, in Kant's terminology, it has no exceptions. And therefore, we don't have to worry about arguing about the exceptions because there are none, right? Now, you might want to accuse Kant and say, yeah, but in real life there always will be. But Kant lived an unusual life. He was a philosopher, and by all repute, he really did practice what he preached. To give you a little background, and maybe it was easier for him. I'm not trying to impoverish what Kant is telling us about perfect duties and having no exceptions, but if your life is a relatively simple life, not in terms of your intellectual cogitations, but in terms of your lifestyle, if you lead a fairly unembellished life, then it is easier perhaps to tread a narrow moral path. Now, Kant spent his entire life in the town of Königsberg, which is a town that was then in East Prussia. So he never left Königsberg. And in fact, his nickname was the Flute of Königsberg. He took walks around town at a regular time every day. You could sort of set your clock by him walking past your window. He was a teacher. He wasn't even a professor. He was a private teacher, and he tutored students for a living. And his students, what we have indicates that he was a very patient and very, very, very kind teacher, and a very good teacher. And he spent a lot of time writing, of course, and thinking. Also in the library, although he never traveled very far anywhere outside of Königsberg, he wrote travel logs on Egypt and other fascinating places, historically and culturally fascinating places. So he convinced people to travel to these places, although he himself had never been there. He wrote these travel logs without ever having left Königsberg. He also wrote on astronomy, and he predicted, actually, he is the one who came up with the nebular hypothesis. All right, he was thinking about the cosmos and about, pictures and models of cosmic phenomena. And he came up with the idea of nebulae. Needless to say, he never looked through a telescope. He just used his rational mind. Reading about astronomy, he came up with the nebular hypothesis. He also wrote a book on parenting. And again, perhaps needless to say, he never married, and he never sired any offspring, but he still wrote a book on parenting. So Kant's lived a very simple life, and so he probably wasn't involved in too many activities that would have been temptations to his duties. Let's put it this way. If you live a quiet life, if you're fortunate enough, or you choose to and are successful at living a quiet life, and you don't have too many dealings with the world, political dealings and business dealings and all kinds of potentially messy dealings with the world, then you don't have to bend or break your own rules, right? It's arguably going to be a more straightforward task to abide by duties. And he did. Imperfect duties don't mean exceptions to the rules, however. Imperfect duties, in case you're wondering. So what are imperfect duties? Okay, well, imperfect duties are going to be duties which are going to apply differently to different people. So, in other words, if you have a duty to look after your health, Kant would say you do, how you exactly look after your health is going to vary from person to person, just much like Aristotle's virtue, right? Of if you're, if it's a virtue to exercise, then everybody's going to have some different amount for them, which is the virtuous amount. You remember Aristotle, I hope. So it's not going to be the same recipe. It's not one size fits all. Whereas, as we already know from the categorical imperative, we have, for example, a duty not to lie, right? One of the examples we looked at was truth telling. So we have a duty to tell the truth. That's a perfect duty. It means under no circumstances should you lie to anybody. So that's a perfect duty. But on the other hand, if you have a duty to take care of yourself, that's an imperfect duty because everyone is going to be doing he's going to do it differently, okay? Everyone will do it a little bit differently. Whereas telling the truth is the same for everybody. Looking after your health is different for everybody. Is this clear? Please tell me yes or no. I'm assuming yes, because I'm not reading your chat room right now. I'm in this room, so I don't want to lose the ability to turn the page. Fine. So you get this. There are duties toward yourself. We all have duties toward self, and we have duties toward others. I'll come on to that later. And those duties, in turn, can be conceived of as either perfect, meaning no exceptions, right? Very strict. He's a very strict guy. Right? Strict with himself and strict with others. So no exceptions. Those are perfect duties, and imperfect duties, which are not exceptions to rules, but rather rules which will apply differently to different people. Hence the notion of imperfection. Okay, that's what it means. All right. So let's look at his 4 examples. And I will come back to the chat room maybe after the first one and see if there are any questions. I can always return to the text. Okay, so first example, now Kant gives these 4. We looked at truth-telling, we looked at stealing, and we looked at adultery last day, right? So now we'll look at Kant's examples. Number 1, a man feels sick of life as a result of a series of misfortunes that has mounted to the point of despair. So someone's really in very dire straits, yeah? But is still so far in possession of his reason as to ask himself whether taking his own life may not be contrary to his duty to himself. So he's contemplating suicide, right? This is Kant's, roundabout way of saying he's thinking about killing himself. And, unfortunately, we have a lot of suicides in our society, and people often commit suicide because they're driven to despair, aren't they? That's a cause, very often a cause. You could talk about depression, you could talk about psychosis, or you could talk about other things, but often people are driven to despair and they see no way out, and they take their own lives. Unfortunately, that happens. So Kant says now he applies the test. So now he's going to apply the very rational person, right, who's despairing enough to contemplate suicide, but also rational enough to apply the categorical imperative. This is a very enviable kind of rationality, if you could be that rational all the time. So Kant, has him applying it. Can the maxim of my action really become a universal law of nature? His maxim is, now this is very careful formulation. So, of course, how we formulate the maxim will ultimately have a lot to do with whether it passes the test or not. So be careful how you formulate the rule that you're about to apply, right, before you run it through the categorical imperative. His maxim is, from self-love, I make it my principle to shorten my life if its continuance threatens more evil than it promises pleasure. And just think about this, okay? Why does he want to shorten his life? Because he actually would prefer to live a life without despair, right? He actually cares about himself. If he were not in despair, he would choose to live. And so if the fact that he would choose to live if he were not in despair shows that fundamentally at the foundation of his being, there is this self-love, or we would call self-preservation, or desire to live. But because he foresees that his life at the moment is only going to bring more evil than it promises pleasure, he's now contemplating making an end to it because he doesn't see any further joy of living. He only sees despair of living. So he still would prefer to live if he could. So from self-love, I make it my principle to shorten my. I mean, he loves himself, and therefore he can't stand himself in despair. Right? If you hated yourself, think about it. This is a very subtle point. If you hated yourself, maybe you'd be happy that you were in despair in a certain perverse way, right? So if you really disliked yourself, in theory, that would make you happy to be despairing because you know it would be compatible with your dislike of yourself. So there'd be no problem. But it's only because you like yourself that you're unhappy that you're in despair. It's an interesting psychological point, okay? So that's his maxim. You don't want to think about this, but that's his maxim. So then he asks, could this principle of self-love become a universal law? I mean, this particular formulation of, cutting it short because of despair. He then says it is seen at once that a system of nature by whose law the very same feeling whose function is to stimulate the furtherance of life should actually destroy life would contradict itself and consequently could not subsist as a system of nature. Hence, this maxim cannot possibly hold as universal law of nature and is therefore entirely opposed to the supreme principle of all duty. In other words, it fails the categorical imperative, and so Kant says that because it fails the categorical imperative, this guy is not permitted to commit suicide. He has a duty rather to live and not to kill himself. Right? So for this reason, Kant does not justify suicide as being a morally permissible act. Okay? At least not on the basis of that maxim. Right? And then you might want to argue, yeah, but if I hated myself, then, I would want to kill myself, right? I mean, that would be Kant's reasoning. If I hated myself, then, why wouldn't I be able to kill myself? Why, if that changed the premise, right? If I'm in despair and I hate myself, why don't I kill myself? Well, Kant would say that'll fail too. Because if you hate yourself, then if you kill yourself, you're going to end the possibility of hating yourself. It's going to contradict itself too. You no longer hate yourself. It's sort of, if you love to hate yourself, then you can't kill yourself either. That's even more convoluted reasoning. But I think it's more straightforward to go with Kant's example. Okay. Let's do one more, and then I'll come back to the chat room with you. So this one is similar to the one we've seen before, actually, about lawing. But it's a parallel example. This is number 2. Another finds himself driven to borrowing money because of need. Well, a lot of us, I'm sure, can relate to this. We've all undoubtedly had to borrow money at times, right? Because we need it. Okay. So he well knows that he will not be able to pay it back. Okay? In this case, this person, in fact, doesn't even see the possibility of paying it back. But he sees, too, he will get no loan unless he gives a firm promise to pay it back in a fixed time. Well, of course, usually if people lend you money, the clock is running, all right? There's going to be a certain period during which you may not be charged interest. If you're a student loan, or if it's a bank, you're going to have a teaser rate maybe, or whatever. But at some point, you got to pay it back. And usually you have to put up collateral too, right? In case you don't pay it back, they can take your collateral. But in any case, normally you have to promise to repay a loan, okay? Even if a friend lends you money, usually, your friend will be more lenient because your friend is your friend. So your friend might lend you money and say, see if you can relate to this. I mean, your friend might say, well, just pay me back when you can, right? Your friend isn't going to make you sign something, but your friend is still going to say, pay me back, but when you can, right? So there's always going to be some promise. Wherever you borrow from, there'll be a promise to repay. Okay. So now he wants to ask himself if he can make a false promise. Right? So he knows that he's not going to be able to pay the money back, so he knows that any promise he gives to pay it back will be false. So he's inclined to do it because he needs some money, right? And so his maxim is, in this case, if we're going to test, we're going to make a test of the categorical imperative to see if it's permissible. In this case, his maxim would be, and yours or mine would be, under these circumstances, whenever I believe myself short of money, I will borrow money and promise to pay it back, though I know this will never be done. Right? So in other words, can you make a false promise, right? Is that morally permissible? Okay. So he says this principle of self-love, because you want the money because you need it for something. Obviously, you want to further your interests, so you do have some self-love, right? Or personal advantage, one of the two or both, is perhaps quite compatible with my own entire future welfare. I mean, we could all see, Kant is saying, where it might be advantageous for us to borrow money and never pay it back. That might be something we could contemplate doing, just as some of you last day, in fact, a good many of you, I think we're quite happy to acknowledge there were times when you've been tempted to tell a lie in order to get out of a difficult situation, right? Lie your way out of trouble. And most of you were unabashedly forthcoming and saying, yeah, I could, envision or have been in a situation where I was willing to lie, or I think it might have been, a way of getting out of trouble. But you see that we saw that lying fails the categorical imperative, right? So although you could see that a lie might be beneficial to yourself, you think in a particular situation, you can't really lie because it's not morally right according to the categorical imperative. So this is a parallel case where you believe yourself short of money and you need to borrow money and promise to pay it back, even though you know you won't pay it back. So it's really another kind of a lie. So making a false promise is it okay to make a false promise is the question. Yeah. And is that the right thing to do? Well, the only way to know that, says Kant, of course, is to test it according to the categorical imperative. So how would things stand if my maxim became a universal law, right? That's the test. He says, I then see straight away that this maxim can never rank as a universal law and be self-consistent, but must necessarily contradict itself. Why? Because he says the universality of a law, that everyone believing himself to be in need may make any promise he pleases with the intention of not to keep it, would make promising and the very purpose of promising itself impossible, since no one would believe that he was being promised anything, but would laugh at utterances of this kind as empty shams, right? Because if it's a universal law to make false promises, then if you promise something to somebody in such a world, of course they're not going to believe you because they know that it's a law that you're making a false promise. And so it's going to self-destruct in practice. Yeah, the promise will be impossible to make because everybody knows it's a false promise, and so it's meaningless. And therefore, it fails the test of the categorical imperative. And so even though it may be personally advantageous for you to do it in your own particular circumstances, it fails the categorical imperative test, contradicts itself if you make it a universal law, and therefore, says Kant, it's wrong. Okay? And that would, your reason and your duty to reason and your will as practical reason would forbid you from doing anything that does not pass that test. Okay? So that's the first 2 of 4 cases. Let me return to the room with you, come back to the chat room, and see if you have any questions about this. Okay, I'm back to the chat room. Do you have any comments or questions about either of those first 2 examples? You guys don't. Okay, well, either you're really on the ball this morning. Not yet. Okay, Georgina. Yeah, that's fine. Maybe you're following Kant, and that's a great thing, as long as it's making sense to you. It's he's a great rationalist, and he's compelling us to reason about morality. But if you're following his reasoning, then well and good. So in that case, I propose that we go back to the text, and we'll have a look at the next 2 examples. Okay. All right. Let's see. Okay, you're all with me. So far, so good. All right. Let's then return to the text, if I can do that. Is it still there for you? Somebody please say yes or no. Okay, thank you. All right. So if it's still, we're good. Sometimes it doesn't let me flip back and forth, but today it's being permissive. Okay, so example 3. Now again, this is a situation, and please put this in context, okay? He's writing this toward the end of the 18th century, and at that point, historically, the South Sea Islands had just been discovered by the English sea captain Cook. Right? Captain Cook had discovered parts of Polynesia, and in the process had discovered that life in Polynesia, like Tahiti and some of these other places, these exotic South Pacific islands, was almost like the Garden of Eden, because you have beautiful weather, palm trees, coconut palms, beautiful beaches, coral reefs. You have all kinds of wonderful fruits and vegetables growing in these tropical climates. You have fishes of every kind in the sea, fish, shellfish, and no big predators, no natural predators on these islands. So it's like paradise, right? If you ever go to these places, I mean, I've been to Hawaii. That's not quite as exotic by these standards as the South Pacific, but pretty exotic nonetheless. And even though Hawaii is now a U.S. state and has been modernized, you could still see vestiges of the Polynesian culture and how relaxed and how beautiful everything is. In a sense, it's like being in the Garden of Eden. And so the observations of the Europeans who first got there were that people were able to basically do very little and have a really nice life of leisure. There was no industrial revolution, there was no real economy, and everything that they needed was there in abundance for them. So it was very leisurely and almost like paradise. So there was no incentive to really do very much. And that's the focus of his third question. And I'm just bringing this to your attention because in parentheses, he will use the South Sea Islanders as an example of what you shouldn't do, because he's caught up in a very different time and a very different era. The industrial revolution in Europe could not be different than the paradise-like life in the South Sea Islands. So anyway, Kant says a third case takes place where someone finds in himself or herself nowadays, a talent whose cultivation would make him a more useful man for all purposes. So find in yourself some excellence, okay? It could be, going back to Aristotle, it could be an intellectual excellence, it could be a musical excellence, it could be an athletic excellence, it could be whatever excellence you discover in yourself. You have some gift, you have some natural talent. All of us have something we can do with cultivation, okay? And you know that you have some gift, all right? You have some ability. But Kant says, you see yourself in a comfortable circumstance. Maybe now imagine that you won the lottery, okay? Or imagine that let's say some wealthy relative died and left you a ton of money. Okay, so you in fact now have no obligation materially to do anything but enjoy your situation. Suppose you suddenly came into money, and so basically you could give yourself over to pleasure and not have to work and not have to cultivate any talent at all that you might have, but just enjoy life in some sense, okay? Without worrying about improving your natural aptitudes. So you're going to ask yourself, is this okay? I mean, is this morally acceptable for me just to, kind of enjoy life and not do anything more, make no more effort? So that's a question for the categorical imperative. So is it, does my maximum neglect my natural gifts, besides agreeing in itself with my tendency to indulgence? I mean, maybe all of us would tend toward that. But does this maximum neglecting of my natural gifts agree also with what is called duty? That's the question, okay? Is it the right thing to do in terms of doing my duty? He then sees, Kant's answer is that no, it won't work. Why? Because such a system of nature would indeed always subsist on universal law, though, and that's the allusion to the South Sea Islanders, every man should let his talents rust and should be bent on devoting his life solely to idleness, indulgence, or creation in order to enjoyment. Well, yeah, I think life was very enjoyable, actually, at that point for that kind of culture. Very enjoyable indeed. Um, that Kant is caught up in a very, very different kind of culture, one which was devoted to, particularly in Germany, where he grew up, is devoted to what we call today the Protestant work ethic. Has anybody heard of the Protestant work ethic? Tell me yes or no if you have. You can, I'm going to flip back to the room for a second. See about that. I'm curious to know. You have. Okay, so that's still floating around. Abraham has not. Okay, I will explain it to you. And Kant would be very much caught up in it, so I'm going to say something about it because it's an important piece of background information in order for him to run his argument. It's called particularly Protestant work ethic. It comes from an older thing. It comes from actually, it's part of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and it's much older than Protestantism. But there's a saying that comes also from Catholicism. I'll type the saying, and you tell me if any of you have heard this saying: idle hands do the devil's work. Has anybody heard that saying? Idle hands do the devil's work? You have, Nivriti. I'm not surprised. I know that many of you have, because that's still being taught, right? That is still being taught. That's part of this so-called Protestant work ethic, but that saying's even older. That's something that the Roman Church would also teach, that idleness is sinful. Yeah? Idleness is sinful. We're supposed to be busy. In other words, you're supposed to be busy, okay? And it goes back even further than that, okay? If you want an even older origin, you can find it in the book of Genesis. And in the book of Genesis, when Adam and Eve get kicked out of paradise, what does God say to them? Any of you remember this well enough? If you're scholars or if you're, Bible readers, you will know this. I remember it because I was taught it at one time, that in the book of Genesis, when we ate the apple, we made the big mistake and ate the apple and got kicked out of Eden, right? God said, you will now have to work by the sweat of your brow. You remember this? He says, we're now condemned to work by the sweat of our brows. Yes, that's more or less what God says is our punishment. And when we get kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and for Immanuel Kant, South Sea Islands, the stories he's hearing from these sailors who come back, it's like, this is like a Garden of Eden, right? It's really like a Garden of Eden. So when we got kicked out of Eden, apparently, and at least according to Scripture, God's saying, now you will have to work by the sweat of your brow. You're going to have to earn a living. So this whole idea of idleness being sinful has a long history. It goes all the way back in Scripture. And then each branch of the Judeo-Christian tradition in particular has definitely made a lot of hay with that as a moral prescription. So that the descent, and it got most rarefied during the Industrial Revolution, when basically England and Germany were the leading nations, and they were Protestant nations. There was Anglican in England, and Luther's Protestant Revolution in Germany, more or less took over. So it became clear that you had to constantly be active, and people started measuring your work to society in terms of your production and your productivity, right? So part of the fixation of the Industrial Revolution was measurement. So your time was being measured, your productivity was being measured, your output was being measured, the produce of factories were being measured, how many things can you make in a day, and all this stuff comes from this notion of productivity, and also from an ancillary notion which is connected with it, that you are supposed to work and never be idle, but you're not necessarily allowed to enjoy your work. This is another peculiar twist of the so-called Protestant work ethic, because pleasure is sinful. Okay, at the same time as idleness is sinful, pleasure is sinful, right? You're taught that. So basically, you have to be constantly busy, but you're not allowed to enjoy yourself either. Okay, it's a very strange psychology. I mean, we accept it in the West because a lot of us are brought up with it, that you're constantly allowed to be busy, but you're not particularly supposed to love your work. Okay, can I tell you a true story? May I tell you a true story? I'll just disclose a little bit because it's, I think, very illuminating. Even in the last century. I did my PhD in England, okay? And England is one of the leading nations England is one of the leading nations with consumed by this kind of what I'm calling the hangover of both the Protestant work ethic, where everybody works really hard, but also that it's sinful to enjoy your work. So everyone works really hard, but they have to pretend they don't enjoy their work, or they really don't enjoy their work, and they think that they're not supposed to enjoy their work. So where's the best food in Europe? Where's the best food in Europe? It's in the south. It's in Italy. It's in France. It's in Spain, right? And people enjoy their food because in those countries they can confess their enjoyment. If they commit the sin of enjoyment, they can confess it, and then they can have another great meal. Okay, so Italian food is world class. French food world class. Spanish food world class. The Mediterranean countries, Greek food for that matter, although they're Eastern Orthodox faith, but all the great cuisine of the Mediterranean region is and as you go further north, food gets more and more bland. Okay, I mean the Swiss are not famous for their food. The Germans are not famous for their food, and the English used to be famous for food being particularly bad. Now, of course, they enjoy good food, but if they enjoy good food in England, they could say, "But that's because it's Italian food or French food or Spanish food, so they're the sinful ones." Like we could enjoy it, but it's not really our food, so we're not sinful. Okay, it's very, very peculiar. So when I was doing my PhD in England, I remember as I'm doing my thesis and I'm having conversations, my supervisor was great and he was he's giving me a lot of critical feedback. That's what happens. I'd write a chapter, I'd go in and, he would dissect it and, he'd critique it and then I'd go back and revise it. That's how you do a PhD. It takes a long time. And he was very good and really a great teacher. But we used to argue about things, philosophy, right? What are you going to do? We were arguing about things. And one I'll never forget, he was very English, right? And I'm not very English, okay? So he was very English. And so he said to me one day, he suddenly slammed my thesis down on the table. And I'll never forget this. And he looked at me and he said, I know what the problem is. He said, you enjoy philosophy. He said to me in like an accusatory tone, he said, you enjoy philosophy. So this was the thing. I was supposed to be working very hard, but not really enjoying it. Okay, that's Protestant work ethic. Okay, yes, LOL. It was hysterical. I burst out laughing because that was the difference between maybe the North American way and the English way, where we Americans enjoy things, right? We're allowed to enjoy things. Maybe too much. Maybe we err on the side of hedonism, okay? But it is hysterical. You say, no, you enjoy philosophy. Look, I'm not supposed to do that. Okay, so I think it's fine to love what you do, but that's certainly, a little bit tricky, okay? So I hope that contextualizes, Kant and what's going on here with Kant and why he would say that if you have some natural talent, you really have a duty to develop it. You're not allowed just to enjoy life, okay? You have to be constantly busy perfecting whatever skill you have. This comes out of a particular cultural ethos. So we have to, I think, in our contemporary context, take that with a grain of salt, okay? And you need to have that historical and that cultural perspective sometimes to realize that philosophies are not grown in a vacuum, right? Your philosophy of life is going to be influenced by your own experience of life and obviously the culture in which you grow up, okay? And every philosopher also will be the same in that way, all right? So back to Kant. So he's going to say, it can't become a universal law. Of course, I could be tempted, and I could see that living in paradise could certainly be tempting, right? Devoting my life, as he says, solely to idleness, indulgence, and procreation would certainly be a tempting thing to do. In other words, devoting my life to enjoyment alone. But Kant says, I cannot will that it become a universal law. And why not? Why can't you will it? Why did it fail the test? Well, he says, because as a rational being, remember, this is all based on reason. Right? As a rational being, you would see that your powers need to be developed and they serve you and are given to you for a purpose. So we're created by God. He doesn't say that explicitly, but he is a religious. He's not using religion, but in between the lines, he believes that if you have a talent in life, it's kind of God-given, or at least given by nature, and therefore it would be wrong not to develop it. It would be you'd be kind of squandering a great gift, and therefore you cannot morally be satisfied with a life of pure enjoyment or self-indulgence. Okay, so even if you inherited a lot of money, you even have a better chance. That would mean you'd be free from maybe doing a lot of things that would be interfering with your ability to develop your talent, and you'd have all that much more power and time on your soul to develop it, but you should still want to develop it. Okay, so that's his answer to this third. I'll just flip back for a second. That's his answer in the third case. Okay? So even if you find yourself in comfortable circumstances, you should still not be idle. You should, in fact, cultivate whatever talents that are given to you, either by nature or by God, depending on how you believe, whether it's a genetic, uh, lottery that you won, or whether God created you in this way. Either way, you have some gift, and Kant says it would be immoral for you to squander it through lack of development. Is that clear? All right. So, fourthly, this is the fourth. This is a very interesting example, I think, very interesting indeed. And it has to do really with being a charitable or a generous person. It's still focused on you, right? It's still focused on what you as a moral agent ought to do or ought not to do. But it ends up being very interesting socially, I think. So consider this case. You yourself are flourishing, okay? In the fourth example, okay, you're fine, you're doing well, okay? Let's say. But you see others who have to struggle with great hardships, and actually whom you could easily help. So, well, everybody, excuse me, don't tell me we're all in this situation. Anybody who's not homeless, basically, and begging on the street, can usually afford to do something for somebody else, right? Even if somebody, a dollar. New York, they always ask for a dollar, right? Or whatever, maybe more now. But most of us can part with a dollar, and people with great means can certainly part with much, much more. And you know that there's no end to poverty in the world, there's no end to hardship in the world. And in our particular situation, COVID has created huge economic issues. So there are more people. I'm seeing food banks where I live. I've never seen food banks like this. And I've only about food banks to people who are basically hungry and who need philanthropy in order to eat properly every week. Families need more philanthropy than ever. I don't have to make this case, right? Even though this is still a relatively wealthy country, there's a lot of hungry people in America, for one thing. All right, homeless people, for one thing. For another thing, okay. So so flourishing is relative, right? But we all see others who have to struggle perhaps with greater hardships than us. Even if we're struggling, you can always find somebody better off and always find somebody worse off. Okay. And so you yourself may be flourishing, just to say at this moment you're okay, and you may even be a little more better. And you know that there are others who are struggling, and you know that you could easily help. And by that, he's not being specific. This is like an imperity, so you could give something, whether it's your time, right? Or whether it's working a little bit as a volunteer or giving a little money or whatever, you could easily do that. And you think to yourself, what does it matter to me? Let's say you're going to think like Scrooge, right? And what does it matter to me? Let everyone be as happy as heaven wills. In other words, not my problem, right? Or as he can make himself. Let everybody be as happy as God wants them to be, or as happy as they can make themselves be. And I won't deprive them of anything. In other words, I'm not going to harm anybody, and I won't envy them, certainly. But I have no wish to contribute anything to anybody else's well-being or to support anybody else's distress. Okay? So Kant is putting himself in the position of somebody who basically is saying, I have no responsibility to help anybody else at all, really. Okay, it's their problem. Huh? All right. Now, here's the question. Will this pass the categorical imperative? Well, Kant says as follows. In this, if such an attitude were a universal law of nature, in other words, that nobody ever helps anybody under any circumstances, right? We're pretending it's now a law of nature that nobody helps anybody. Okay. He thinks, on the one hand, well, maybe we could get along on that basis. Better, no doubt, here he can't help injecting a little bit of his own cynicism, okay? A little bit of his own social commentary bleeds through into this example. And he says, maybe better off that way than if everybody prates about sympathy and goodwill. On the other hand, cheats where he can, traffics in human rights or violates them in other ways. So Kant is saying better to do nothing for anybody than to be a hypocrite and pretend to help people or even help people in some sense at the expense of doing worse things. You know, I mean that's an interesting moral question in and of itself, is it not? Do you want an example of this? I'll give you an example. I mean, we can think about Robin Hood as being it's not exactly the example here. I'm coming back to the room to be with you for a second. This isn't exactly what I'm just talking about, but if we imagine, you all know the story of Robin Hood, right? Robin Hood. Surely you know about Robin Hood.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, and what does he do? What is the basis? What is Robin Hood doing?
He takes from the rich and gives it to the poor.
Exactly. He steals from the rich and gives to the poor. Okay, so we already know that fails the categorical imperative, right? So, but that's not an example that Kant is giving here. But it's still a moral question that comes up. Is Robin Hood justified in stealing, right? That's our moral question. Because if Robin Hood is taking the money and putting it in a Swiss bank account, that's probably not justifiable. If Robin Hood is stealing from the rich in order to give to the poor, then maybe that is justifiable, and you would have to make your own moral argument, right? Like altruism. Yeah, well, altruists, excuse me, Nivriti, it differs in one significant sense. Robin Hood is not exactly an altruist. An altruist is someone who sacrifices themselves for others. Okay, an altruist would be someone who gives their own money to another one, even though maybe they give more than they can afford. That's altruism. Robin Hood is something else because he's not giving his own money; he's giving somebody else's money. All right. So if you're a cynic, you're going to call him a socialist. But listen, Robin Hood's a big bet. I'm saying Kant's example is not an example of Robin Hood. Kant's example is an example of the following kind. He's saying you would be, and this is just an aside, but I think it's important to make the point. He's saying you'd be better off morally if you had that as a universal law and never helped anybody. You'd be still, in Kant's view, better off than if you went around making big speeches about wanting to help everybody and at the same time cheating and actually enriching yourself on the basis of trafficking in human rights, as Kant says back then. But talking about how you're a big benefactor and how you believe in, let's say you believe in human rights, but actually you're cheating. Okay, there are all kinds of scandals about that. People who are, some people, not all by any means, but some people who pretend to be social activists who may still be exploiting other people, for example. Okay. So various kinds of people who would be typically the Nike scandal. You know, the Nike child labor scandal that came on the scene a few years ago. Does anybody remember the Nike child labor scandal where you had all these celebrity athletes? You do, Georgina. Okay. Well, it was exactly what Kant's talking about. You had these supposed role models for society, right? Who were really celebrity role models who were supposedly doing good things, or at least saying the importance of doing good things, but at the same time, they're supporting Nike and maybe getting endorsements from Nike and wearing Nike sneakers. And Nike was, exploiting child labor to build these things in sweatshops in the developing world. So that was blown out of the water. You wrote a paper about it. In which class, Georgina? Just curious, which course did you write a paper about it?
Critical thinking.
Oh, wow. Okay. Oh, that's more than critical thinking. That's that's critical thinking applied to some very big ethical topics. All right. So you get the point, right? So Kant would be saying that if you're doing that, you're morally worse than if you just don't give anything to anybody. It's worse to be a hypocrite, in other words, than to be a Scrooge. Is that clear? Okay. I mean, that's just Kant's view. You could certainly disagree with that. But obviously Kant doesn't like hypocrisy very much, and he lets that show through. Okay, he doesn't like it. But you could agree with him, Ibrahim. I mean, I don't like hypocrisy either, although it's hard sometimes to be a hypocrite. But Kant certainly would prefer us just to be honest and say, I'm sorry, I don't believe in giving things to people. I don't believe in charity. At least that's honest. Okay? Rather than pretending that you're philanthropic and actually doing great harm or supporting causes that do great harm while you preach doing great good. That would be hypocrisy. Okay, so you can agree with him. And I mean, I can see that there are definitely moral grounds for agreeing with him. So let's go back. Now, for some reason, the application has finally given up the ghost here. So I'll have to reshare it with you, which I'll do momentarily. It doesn't like it if I go back and forth too many times. Okay, so now we're here. This. Yes?
No, it is black.
It's black. Darn. Look at that. This is what happened. It somehow decided not to share anymore. Well, there's no great loss. I can read to you what I'm seeing. I'll try it one more time. But it says that it's, I have to reload the session. Okay. I don't think I want to do that because I might end up losing the session. All right. So I'm not going to reload the session. That will take me out of the room and have to reload the room. We have 15 minutes left. Will it be okay with you if I just read and talk to you from the text and you can read it on your own? Is that all right?
Yes.
Okay. I'd rather not lose the whole session. That's a big gamble. Okay. So obviously there's some problem with the connection. As long as we can see and hear each other, we'll satisfy. We'll be satisfied with that. So let's go back to the text momentarily. So we've already seen where this is headed. So Kant thinks actually that the real test here is, can you just carry on as a Scrooge and not ever help anybody and say to yourself, well, that's God's will. So like everyone is rich or poor according to my fault. Hey, that's what heaven wills. Kant says it's what heaven wills, meaning what God wills. Or in fact, everyone's like dependent on themselves, to make it or break it. So it's not my problem. And so this character is saying, I'm not going to do anything. Is that supportable? Kant says no. Kant says that will actually fail categorical imperative. And the reason is, it's very interesting. He says, in a hypothetical world where that were a law of nature, he says it would not work. Because, why? Because everyone, there are situations every day, in fact, that arise where we need love and sympathy from others, Kant says. And in which such a law of nature sprung from his own will, he would rob himself of all hope of help he wants for himself. So in other words, if you think carefully about it, and is probably at least as true today as it was at the end of the 18th century when Kant was writing this, that really, if you think about it, you cannot get through the day without getting some kind of help. Never mind sympathy and love. If you can get sympathy and love, that's great. But even just basic other people. Can anyone give an example of basic things that other people help us with on a daily basis? Do any immediate examples spring to mind? Like, can we get through a day without any help from anybody? Ask for services. Exactly, Georgina. What kind of services are we thinking about? Give me a concrete example. Any. Sure, coffee. Well, that's important for me. As it happens, I make my own coffee, but guess what? I need someone to provide the coffee beans, right? I can't make coffee unless a whole bunch of people in a whole industry are growing coffee, harvesting coffee, roasting coffee beans, packaging coffee, selling, even if it's fair trade coffee. I still need the coffee beans, right? I need all kinds of help. I don't even know the people. There's people I don't even know who are helping me to have my coffee every day in the same street. Okay? Post office, exactly. Banks, exactly. Retail stores, restaurants, the subway, medical help, the post office. I mean, if you think about it, groceries, exactly. How come there's groceries on the shelves? We're lucky there's groceries on the shelves. That takes the help of huge industries, and we don't even know most of the people in them. We only know the guy maybe who bags our groceries or who checks us out, at the cash, or who stocks the shelves. We know only the end chain, the end part of that chain, the people we encounter in the grocery store. But professors teaching classes. Well, thank you, Elijah. I mean, that's true. That we invest our care and attention in this, and it's not just for money. Believe me, if it were for money, we'd all be lawyers or stockbrokers or something else. But this is what we do, and the life we choose. And I love it myself. So essential workers of every kind, Georgina, particularly these days in the healthcare sector and first responders, right? Okay, so it didn't take us much effort to realize that in a hypothetical world where nobody's offering any help to anybody, that's impossible. That would be absolutely impossible. The world couldn't work. It would fall apart, contradict itself. So therefore, Kant says, we have to help others. We have a duty. And again, it's an imperfect duty because exactly how you help depends on you, right? What gifts do you have? What capacities do you have? What resources do you have to help others? That will vary from person to person. It's not going to be identical for any two people, but we all have a duty to help. So it is an imperfect duty as to a perfect duty, which is the same for all of us, like a duty to tell the truth or a duty not to make false promises. Clear? Okay, is that all good? So those are Kant's 4 examples, and they're very thought-provoking. I think they're very interesting examples. Okay, so now we come to something, and I want to wrap up this part. I'm going to fast forward a little bit through the text, and we get to the second formulation, right? And it's a very, very interesting one. And there are 2 notions that are going to be introduced here by Kant. And really, it's autonomy and dignity, believe it or not. Kant is the one who introduces these notions into contemporary Western philosophy, this idea of autonomy and dignity. And dignity is such a big deal today. It's one of the Sustainable Development Goals, as far as I know, of the UN. And, that people have a right to dignity. There's a lot of conversation now about right to dignity, and Kant is the one who fingers this. It's in this latter part of your reading, and he talks about autonomy and dignity. Let me enter those 2 points in the chat room just so we have the words on the table. Okay, autonomy meaning what? Autonomy, Greek word meaning self-government, right? Self-government. The idea of autonomy. In other words, autonomy in this case is the enemy of paternalism. Right? If you're a patient in a possession, well, it doesn't mean possession, Nivriti, so much as it means a self-government, self-rule. So you have, in other words, the ability to rule over yourself, as opposed to abdicating that and giving somebody else the authority to rule over you. And this doesn't mean in every which way, because we're still all subject to laws. But specifically, if you think about it in a particular context of bioethics, which is a big issue today, there's something called patient autonomy. So in other words, doctors and nurses, people who are looking after you and maybe doing so very well, they can't just treat you like a piece of meat and do what they want. They have to get your consent, right? They have to get your informed consent. Yeah? So it's power of self. That's exactly right, Nivriti. It's power of self. So people cannot just do what they want to do with you. They have to get your consent to do it. That's because you have autonomy, right? You have the power to grant or not to grant consent. You could refuse treatment, right, if you want. So you have certain autonomy. Yeah? They have to inform you about what they want to do to you and what are the benefits and what are the potential risks. And you're the one who has to approve it. So you have autonomy in that context. We have autonomy in many other contexts. As adults, we have quite a bit of autonomy. So Kant focuses on autonomy as being a very important thing. And the other thing that he focuses on is dignity. That's in the latter part of the reading. And dignity, I don't have to tell you how fundamentally important that is to us as human beings. Everyone, in some sense, is dignified. And it's not that you're entitled to dignity. It's that by virtue of being human, you are dignified. And it's only when a lack of dignity is manifest that we see this as a moral deficiency, right? If you're robbed of dignity, deprived of dignity. That's nobody gives you dignity because you already have it. The element that's missing sometimes in societies would be lack of recognition of the dignity of a fellow human, and that would be, in Kant's view, a morally bad thing as well. Okay, and he's pretty early on to say this, late 18th century. So give him a bit of credit for anticipating how important that is to our moral well-being, since it's such a big issue now. Okay, but it's in your edition of that text. So what's the second formulation then? We'll cut to the chase, and this is on page 592. In this particular case, page 592, my version of the text, but you'll see it under the formula of the end in itself. So it's called the second formulation of the categorical imperative. Okay, second formulation, and it says as follows: act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. Okay. Now, he goes through his same four examples, and this is your homework on Kant. You take the same four cases and show how you must treat yourself and others not simply as a means to another end, but as ends in themselves. This is easier to understand if we're talking about other people. In other words, we should not, according to this formulation, treat others merely as a means to our own ends. All right, to be absolutely crystal clear, he's saying that people deserve, all human beings deserve, on the basis of our shared humanity, to be treated as rational agents, yes, who are fulfilling their own missions in life, and therefore they're not simply means to our own ends. They are ends in themselves. And so this entails a necessity for mutual respect. Okay, so it's not the case that people are simply out there to be exploited for our own purposes. Is this clear? If you regard other people merely, if you're some kind of predator, or you're some kind of egomaniac, or you're some kind of person who thinks other people exist only for your purposes, you'd be violating that second formulation. Okay, so the second formulation is saying exactly the opposite. That we have to respect ourselves, definitely, but also respect others as people who have their own purposes in life, their own goals in life, their own autonomy and their own dignity in life, and therefore we're not simply means to our ends, but we respect them as having or being ends in themselves too. Okay, and that way we can always have, and it's not contradicting Hobbes. I mean, it's contradicting Hobbes' moral theory, but it's certainly not contradicting the idea of a social contract, right? It's saying, hey, we can have an even better social contract if we have mutual respect, right? It's a better thing if we actually have mutual respect in a relationship. It's going to be better for business. It's going to be better for interpersonal relationships. It's going to be better for professional relationships. It's going to, whatever relationships we're involved with others, if there's mutual respect, that will always enhance the quality of the relationship. But that mutual respect always entails regarding the other person not as just someone who exists for your purposes, but they have their own. And we respect them as ends in themselves, not means to our own end. That's the second formulation, okay? And I think that much is clear. I think all of you get this. I'm pretty sure you all get this. But what you need then to do is to go back, because what he does in the text is, after stating what I just read to you as that formulation, he reapplies it to those four cases that we looked at. So you can see not only how the first formulation of the categorical imperative applies, but also how the second formulation applies also to those four cases. Okay, so that would be your homework for Kant. And I want to finish just by mentioning that next he goes on to the idea of autonomy, which is really a corollary of this. Yes, every rational agent is an end in itself. Yes, every person should be treated as an autonomous being, and not merely as someone who exists for our purposes, but someone who is self-governing and in charge of themselves in a certain way. Okay, so obviously he's against slavery. He's against any kind of despotism, any kind of treating of the other as property, right? Would be completely wrong, because then we'd be denying them autonomy. And the other condition is dignity. This also follows from it. And he says this. He talks about it in a separate section. The dignity of virtue. And this is very important for Kant. That everyone has intrinsic value. You remember we talked about Aristotle and the distinction between instrumental and intrinsic value. I hope you all recall this because we spent quite a bit of time on it, right? So there's a difference between inherent and instrumental value. I'm glad you remember, Mame. I hope all of you do. That something that is intrinsic is inherent. The thing itself has value inherently, like happiness has value inherently. Something that has instrumental value has value because it's useful for some other purpose, right? That's the distinction that Aristotle drew. And what Kant says is that humans have intrinsic dignity. So the human being in the first case and in the overarching case is valuable in and of itself because we all have inherent dignity, and that's intrinsic in us. So to use somebody as an instrument, for your purpose is to and only that is to disregard their inherent value as a human being and therefore to dehumanize them. Okay? So out of Kant and the second formulation comes I think, you're entitled to agree or disagree with him. It's philosophy, right? But I'm saying that to me it touches my heart because Kant starts off as a rationalist and he's supremely concerned with removing the discussion of moral agency into a rational space and to disentangle it from the emotions and from subjectivity. But he ends up through the second formulation reinstating a very humanistic philosophy, a philosophy that is very caring about others because it's respectful of their autonomy and their dignity. And so it ends up stirring, at least in me and maybe in you, some positive, very strong positive emotions about what he deems to be a morally salutary way in which we can relate to each other as human beings. And in such a system, exploitation and other things would be absolutely illegitimate. So for Kant, things like slavery, he was, opposed to it. Things like child labor, things like child soldiers, things like sex trade or any exploitation of people for any reason would be completely contrary to his second formulation. It would disrespect their autonomy and dignity and therefore would not be something that could be morally justified under any circumstances. Okay, so I'll leave Kant there. I hope you see through our brief glimpse of him this week why he's so important in the context of our overview of highlights of Western moral theories. And next week we come to the final philosopher in this set of readings, namely John Stuart Mill. And we're going to look at once again, not surprisingly, completely different view. We're going to look at a moral theory that depends entirely on consequences. Okay? Kant's theory depends entirely on intentions and adherence to the categorical imperative in both its formulations. And not surprisingly, we're going to look at John Stuart Mill, who's also a great moralist and really the first systematic progressive thinker. We're talking about now, almost 100 years later, 1850s and 1860s. We're getting very close to our own times, relatively. And you're going to recognize in John Stuart Mill many of the views that are current today in terms of progressive views. And they come largely from him. One would argue, or not solely, certainly, but his contribution is immense. And so we're going to look at him and his theory of utilitarianism. But I'm just going to say to you that it's impossible to understand Mill's utilitarianism without understanding two other things, okay? Namely, his theory of individual rights. The essay on liberty is one of the most beautiful defenses of individual rights ever written in the English language, ever written. Beautiful, beautiful essay on individual rights and liberties, basically. And also feminism, because he was married to a great philosopher, Harriet Taylor, who in those days in Victorian England wasn't allowed to publish. Women, were not encouraged at all to publish anything. They wrote novels under men's names. You know this, right? George Eliot, for example. They were allowed to write poetry and letters, but nothing else. So he was very influenced by her, and he was on the record. And The Subjection of Women is a very large work of his, which is really her voice too, calling for full equality of women. And this was way ahead of its time also, because as you know, women did not get the vote in England until around the same time as the USA. It was around 1919. Whereas this book that he is, in which he's espousing this view, was around 1869. So it's about 60 years ahead, right? 50 years ahead, rather, of the actual fact. But it was definitely a very large stepping stone. So all I'm saying is that Mill's utilitarianism, and the bumper sticker for that will be the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Okay? That's utilitarian. That's Mill's thesis. And that's what we should try and achieve by our actions, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. So we want the outcome. He says this can't possibly happen unless the greatest number also have individual liberties, and half the greatest number being women, actually more, right? Women are about 52, 54% of the population usually. So women hold up more than half the sky. So he's also saying the greatest happiness for the greatest number could not possibly be achieved until and unless women have equal rights, which is what he's arguing for. Okay, so that he did this in the 1850s and 60s is really quite amazing, but it helped pave the way for the rights revolutions of the 20th century. And in that light, it's important for you to read not only his utilitarianism, but to really understand his utilitarianism, you'll need to want to digest his theory of liberty, individual liberty, and also his theories, obviously, about women's emancipation, what we today would call gender equality. Okay, so that's on the agenda next week. Please finish digesting Kant, and then go ahead and read Mill. And your next essay, your number 2 essay, will be due on the 16th of November. I'm giving you, again, an extra 10 days after we finish Mill. Okay, so I want you to have a chance to digest all of these thinkers for you to, decide ultimately on essay number 2. You're more than welcome, everybody. You're more than welcome. It's very nice to interact with you today. I wish you all a wonderful weekend. And next week, we tackle a really interesting thinker, and I've already given you the overview. So if you want to read ahead, you're encouraged to do so. Have a nice day to you too, and have an amazing weekend. Thank you all, and I'll see you very soon, okay? Bye for now.